是2025年9月2号呀，9月份了哎，刚过完 Labor Day weekend， 我刚从 Columbus 回来，所以这个 weekend 基本上没干什么事情吧。今天 work from home， 后来发现也没什么 email， 还蛮好的。我前段时间读完了黄仁宇的自传《黄河青山》。等下准备做一期节目，那最近准备读完这个很早时间就开始读的一本书，叫《China Economy: What Everyone Needs to Know》，还蛮有意思的。这本书写于2016年，基本上可以说是现在的很多一个一个暴雷的问题呢，在当年其实就有这个迹象。然后他还很好的讲述了中国是怎么从非常贫穷变为富有的一个过程。我感觉是国内的很多课本不会讲得很清楚的一个问题。然后今天就刚好读到一个 topic， 就讲这个 corruption 的问题啊。这本书是16年写的，所以那时候应该是反腐很激烈啊。我就想看看这个美国人是怎么想这个问题的。Corruption has clearly been endemic throughout the reform era, although its shape has shifted with time. In the 1980s, one of the biggest sources of corruption was the two-track price system, 应该就是价格双轨制啊 under which factories committed to sell a certain amount of their output at relatively low planned prices, but they could sell any excess production on the free market at higher prices. This created an incentive for officials to use their influence to purchase goods at low plan prices and then resell them at higher market prices. Outrage at this kind of corruption was an important contributor to the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989。就是因为价格双轨制啊，导致这个89学潮的一个重要因素。The subsequent price reforms, which eliminated the two-track system and led to the acceptance of market pricing for almost all goods except a handful of strategic commodities, eliminated this channel of corruption. In the booming 1990s, an important source of corruption was smuggling, 走私. This was profitable because high tariffs and non-tariff barriers made many goods far more expensive in China than on the global market. In 1992, China's weighted average tariff was 32%, and duties on some popular goods, such as automobiles, were 100% or more. In addition, more than half of imports were subject to various kinds of non-tariff restrictions and impeded their import. By the mid-1990s, smuggling was a gigantic business, turning over billions of dollars a year. 这是厦门的远华案的起点啊。The effect was visible in macroeconomic statistics. In 1998, foreign exchange reserves grew by only 5 billion, even though the official trade surplus and foreign direct investment inflows were each around 45 billion. The difference of more than 80 billion, nearly 8% of GDP, mostly represented money that flew out of China in payment for smuggled goods and other forms of capital flight. Smuggling disappeared as a major form of corruption thanks to draconian crackdowns on big smuggling rings in South China. But more importantly, it was because tariffs and non-tariff barriers were sharply reduced in the late 1990s and early 2000s, making the game not worth the candle. In the first decade of 2000, the corruption boom in urban China offered rich opportunities for rip-offs from land deals and infrastructure projects. Because local governments controlled the land supply, officials could extract bribes for directing prime plots or particular developers. And as in any construction boom, officials routinely received kickbacks on infrastructure contracts. Since China was undergoing the biggest construction boom in history, the scale of corruption was similarly unprecedented, with top officials frequently squirreling away hundreds of millions of dollars in black income. Construction-related corruption almost certainly surged in 2009 and 2010 when the government launched its economic stimulus program, most of which went into infrastructure spending. 这是08年金融危机之后的政策。There have, of course, been numerous other channels for corruption. Officials could get payoffs for delivering any of the many licenses and approvals required for setting up a new business or for executing any major investment project. In many jurisdictions, official appointments and promotions were for sale. Jesus. And for the elite sitting at the top of the system, initial public offerings of major companies offered a comparatively clean way to get rich quick, either to speed up the tortuous IPO approval process, or more likely to buy influence for other purposes. Company officials often gave officials or their family members cheap or free shares ahead of the listing, enabling them to pocket huge profits when the shares started trading. 这就是为什么红二代基本上都在搞金融啊，就是通过 IPO 赚大钱。Profiting from corruption ran right to the top of the political system. The biggest case that the government has acknowledged was that of Zhou Yongkang, who served on the Politburo Standing Committee in 2007 to 2012 and ran the nation's security services. In 2014, Zhou was formally investigated for corruption and expelled from the party. Police claimed to have confiscated assets of 14.5 billion from Zhou, his family members, and his business associates. That amount would rank Zhou as seventh in the list of China's richest people compiled annually by the Shanghai-based Hurun Report. Foreign media have also documented extensive wealth in the immediate family of former Prime Minister Wen Jiabao. 这是那叫红色赌盘啊，那本书写的。US 3 billion according to the New York Times, and current president Xi Jinping US 55 million in Hong Kong property and investments in companies worth US 2 billion according to Bloomberg News. 这还不知道呢。The widespread perception that in the party and the government no one's hands are clean of corruption is probably accurate. Why hasn't corruption stopped economic growth? Given the magnitude and ubiquity of corruption and its apparently rising scale over the last 2 decades, it is worth asking why the wheels haven't come off the Chinese system by now. A solid body of research finds a robust inverse correlation between corruption and economic growth. The more corrupt a country is, the lower its long-run growth rate. And of course, recent history is filled with examples of dictators who accumulated vast wealth by looting their countries, but eventually saw their regimes crumble. The Duvaliers in Haiti, Mobutu, whatever, in there, Presidents Marcos and Suharto in the Philippines and Indonesia, and so on. China has managed to be incredibly corrupt, while at the same time sustaining an economic growth rate of around 10% for 3 decades, and creating a political system that does not look in the least fragile. How could this be? One answer offered periodically by pessimistic analysts is that it is just a matter of time. Uncontrollable corruption will eventually force the system into either political collapse or economic sclerosis. But despite the passage of time, these predictions have failed to pan out. Something else is going on, and three factors seem to be at play. First, for much of the reform era, corruption was in a sense a side effect of reforms that also brought powerful economic benefits. As long as the benefits from restructuring outweighed the stealing by corruption, the system as a whole was sustainable, and especially in the 1980s and 1990s. Certain types of corruption, not all, could be seen as rational economic behavior rather than just looting. The most obvious examples are the arbitrage of plan and market prices in the 1980s and some of the smuggling activity in the 1990s. Under the dual-track price system, the authorities tried to maintain in-plan price controls for many goods, not because those prices were appropriate or economically efficient, but simply because it was politically inconvenient to dismantle the old planned economy price system all at once. The result was artificial shortages of some goods and chronically high inflation. Officials who diverted goods from the plant to the market were, among other things, responding to the market signal that these goods were in high demand and short supply. Once prices were marketized, this type of graft disappeared. The case of smuggling is in some ways even clearer. Some smuggling was just a crime, as when Fujian entrepreneur Lai Changxing bribed dozens of officials to enable him to bring in billions of dollars worth of crude oil and luxury cars without paying duties. But much of it could be seen as a private sector effort to reduce import tariffs. In Guangdong, in the late 1990s, it was routine for business to import some of their materials and components or finished goods they want to sell on the mainland, indirectly via Hong Kong. First, the goods would be sold to an agent or converter in Hong Kong. A week or two later, those same goods would be purchased by the business in Guangdong from another agent at a markup of 15 to 20% over what the converter paid. Everyone knew that customs officials had been paid off in between, but no one asked the questions, and the practice was considered virtually legitimate. In these sorts of transactions, business people were in fact reducing the import tariff from a non-economic rate, typically 40% to 70%, to one that made commerce profitable. As with corruption related to dual-track pricing, this practice vanished once tariffs fell to more reasonable levels. 今天就先读到这儿吧，大家拜拜。